Welcome to Sean and Ari Discuss Israel, the podcast where we deep dive into issues affecting Israeli society and analyze things from our own perspective. I'm your host, Sean, and with me is
Ari. Good to have you back, Sean.
Good to be back. Very important to everyone who's listening. If you appreciate our content, please like and share so that we can get this to more people. Also, comment and let us know if there's any particular issues you want us to talk about in future episodes. Ari, in today's episode, we're going to be discussing the hot topic of Har HaBayit, or the Temple Mount.
All right, let's do it.
All right. So before we get into the issues and what's going on, tell us what we're going to be talking about. What is the Temple Mount? What is Har HaBayit? And why is it so important?
Okay, so the Temple Mount in Hebrew is Har HaBayit, the mountain of the house. It is the single most important site in Judaism and probably one of the most, if not the most important archaeological site in the entire world. It is centered in the old city of Jerusalem. It is where the first and second Jewish temple stood. It is where it is believed where Abraham almost sacrificed his son Isaac, and many, many other occurrences in the Jewish Bible. After the second temple was destroyed, it then became a Roman temple, and then a Christian church, and then a Muslim mosque, and so on and so forth. If you're in the old city of Jerusalem and you go to the Western Wall, you're actually under the Temple Mount. The Western Wall is a wall that was built by King Herod as a retaining wall to hold up the mountain so it could expand the plaza around the Jewish temple. And if you look up on top where we have the Golden Dome of the Rock today, that would have been the center of the first and second Jewish temples. And it's believed by myself and every other believing Jew around the world that is where in the future we'll be building our third temple.
Okay, great. So now that we understand what is Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount, I'm going to quickly run through a brief history of the Temple Mount, starting in the year 70 of the Common Era, very quickly to today. And then I think after that, we need to explain why there's so much controversy. So like you said, both temples stood there. The second Jewish temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. After that, much of Jerusalem was destroyed. Initially, the Romans built a temple to Jupiter there. Following that, when the Roman Empire in the area became Byzantines, it became a church. The church was then destroyed by the early Muslims, and a mosque, actually 2 mosques were built in the area, and this is very important. The area of the Temple Mount, even today, contains 4 Muslim religious holy sites, 2 of which are very noticeable. The one is the Golden Dome, that is the Dome of the Rock, or Haram al-Sharif. The second is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is actually on the side of the Temple Mount. It's important to know that everyone thinks when the Golden Dome is Al-Aqsa, it's 2 completely different things. So the early Muslims built a mosque in the area. The mosque is then destroyed and turned into a church by the early Crusades. The Crusades are then vanquished by the later Muslims, and then the Muslims decree that no non-Muslims are allowed onto the area of Haram al-Sharif, Har HaBayit, or the Temple Mount. And this Muslim decree stays until we get all the way up to the end of the Ottoman period in the early 1900s, when they begin to relax some of the laws, and they allow people non-Muslims to come onto the Temple Mount. And then with the vanquishing of the Ottoman Empire, the British take over, and then we have the new religious authority first under the Mufti, and then in 1948 when Jordan occupies East Jerusalem and the area of the Temple Mount and the Kotel, they establish a new Waqf, a Muslim religious organization that is responsible for maintaining Muslim religious authority over the holy sites in Jerusalem. In June 1967, Israel is victorious in the Six-Day War. Moshe Dayan, the Israeli Minister of Defense, comes onto the Temple Mount himself and makes a verbal agreement with the Waqf, where he says the status quo will remain, where the Waqf is still responsible for all religious undertakings on the top of the Temple Mount itself, and the Jewish authority will be everything below that in the area of the Kotel. And that is what we will call the status quo, and we'll be discussing that further on. And now, Ari, take it away. So we have, from 1967, we have the status quo, but Israel is actually the sovereign over the area.
So I think that when we talk about the Temple Mount or Har HaBayit, it's really important to break it up into two separate discussions. While they overlap a little bit and they have a great effect one on the other, there's focusing on the Temple Mount from the Jewish religious perspective of both from religious belief and of religious law, halakha, and then there's the historical, political, legal side of it, which is a separate discussion. They interact a lot, but they're very separate discussions. I think the more interesting side, I think, is the political legal side of today. We should talk for a minute about the Jewish law side of it, the halakha side of it, first.
I think that's a great place to start. Let's start about the halakha, the Jewish law aspect of Temple Mount and Har HaBayit. I think you want to give a shout out here.
All right, so I want to, before we go into that, I want to first say thank you to Rabbi Roy Zaga, who is from an organization called Biadenu. He's a guide who goes and guides Jewish groups up to Har HaBayit. He studies in a very, very special yeshiva, a special place where they study all of the laws and rituals surrounding Jewish worship in the temple, how it will potentially look in a third temple. They study the religious texts relating to all of that, so that if we magically build the third temple tomorrow, we'll have a group of people who know how to approach it from the correct perspective via Jewish law. He helped me prepare the section on halakha. I had a bunch of questions and stuff that I know already, but he helped me make sure I had the details correct. So a big shout out to Roy Zaga from Biadenu, and we're going to leave a link in the show notes to the organization, where if you are interested in learning more, they have a great website in English and in Hebrew, and they have guided tours that are all free. If you're interested, you can reach out to them. I think it's a great resource to have for more information. So from a halakha perspective, take a halakhic understanding is informed from the rules that applied during the Second Temple. Now, even though that the temple does not stand today, the holiness and the sacredness, is that the right word? Sanctity, right. Okay. So even though the Jewish temple is not standing today, the sanctity of the site is the same. Just because the physical structure doesn't exist, the sanctity is the same. Which means that in order to ascend onto the Temple Mount, as a Jew, you first have to go to a ritual bath. You have to make sure that you're completely clean beforehand, so that there's nothing separating you from the water, and you dunk in a Jewish ritual bath to reach a level of physical purity that is the highest level we can reach today. We are still, no matter what, have some level of impurity, because there's a level of purity we can't reach until the Messiah comes. But that level of purity that we reach allows us to be able to ascend the Temple Mount within the realm while following Jewish law. So for a Jew to go up to the Temple Mount from the perspective of Jewish law, there's two things that you have to do first. There's one, you have to go immerse yourself in the water the same way that a woman every month after her menstruation cycle goes to become more pure again. It's the same level of purity that we're reaching. And we don't wear leather shoes and we don't wear gold, both things which remind us of the original sin of the golden calf. Leather coming from a cow and gold, the reminder of the golden calf. We don't wear leather shoes or outwardly wear gold. I once asked a question about my wedding ring for when I go up, and the answer was unclear, that we're not actually sure if a wedding ring, a wedding band which symbolizes the union of man and woman, even though it's gold, would count as something that would remind us of the sin of the golden calf. That's a side note there. Okay. So when we go up, the question now comes down to, where do you go within the Temple Mount area? It's a huge plaza, and there's geographically within it, there's three sections. There's where the temple stood, if you look at pictures of the Second Temple, there's the big tall T-shaped building in the middle, which is centered on what is now the Dome of the Rock, which is where the Holy Ark was in the Holy of Holies, and the area around it, which was in the Holy of Holies, only the high priest went once a year. In the rest of the area around it, the regular priests did their daily services of sacrifices and the things that they did in the temple, which is an area we don't go today no matter what. And then as you get a little bit further away from that, there is an area called the Azara, the courtyard, which is where the rest of the nation of Israel would come to pray. They'd bring their sacrifices. They would come to commune with God himself in order to reach some level of spirituality that they could then take back with them to their regular life. That's the area we go in today. And then outside of that, there's a huge plaza that King Herod built to expand the entire temple, which is where we actually go today. So no matter what, we're not even getting close. I think the closest we get is about 55 meters, is the closest we get to an area that maybe, there's a question of a very big maybe we're not allowed to go, but we don't even get close to it.
Ari, you've explained the practicality of the Temple Mount, but at the end of the day, it's a religious experience. And you've explained it as with regards to the laws of purity and preparing yourself both physically and emotionally. If it is such a religious place, can you explain a little bit about the controversy? Because there are many Jewish religious authorities that are passionately against any type of prayer or activity on or around the Temple Mount.
Okay, so now we get into the question of religion and politics a little bit. So there's the religious question, the purely Jewish legal question is around, do we know where we're allowed to go, and do we know where we're not allowed to go? So up until the modern era, and we had archaeology and aerial footage, and we can compare the measurements that are listed in the Talmud. We could then put those measurements onto the information we have today. We can mark out very clearly where we're allowed and not allowed to go. From the Jewish law perspective, very dry in that sense, we know where we're allowed to go, and there's no longer a religious question of where you're allowed to and not allowed to be on the Temple Mount from that perspective. The question now comes to, why is there such an opposition from a lot of the more stringent, I would say ultra-Orthodox direction of the religious camp? And it comes down to, if you're allowed to go, then you have to. And it changes the entire way in which we approach our Judaism, because we have many positive commandments within the Torah telling us that we have to come to commune with God in the temple 3 times a year. We have the 3 holidays that we have to come to Jerusalem. Then there's another overall commandment from the weekly portion of Re'eh, where you have to seek God in his home, where there's a positive command to go up. So now, if you're allowed to go up, then it all of a sudden becomes, not only are you allowed to, but you're required to. And if you're required to go up to pray, then it changes the entire focus of all of their religious beliefs, of how we went from being a synagogue-centered religious experience to now we go back to being the temple-centered or the place of the temple-centered religious experience. It shifts the entire approach, because now if we're not only allowed to go up, but we're required to go up, then we're also required to make every effort to start rebuilding the third temple. And that gets into a much bigger question now of the approach to Judaism from an exile perspective to a redemption era. And that's a much bigger philosophical conversation that we can have at a later date in time, I'm sure. And we could probably have people that are way smarter than us come and discuss it. But it comes down to shifting the centrality of the focus of our religious worship out of the synagogue and to the temple.
I'm going to give my perspective on this as well, because I very much agree with you. In part, we're going to disagree later on, to this specific shift. Now, as somebody who's often looking at historical trends, we spoke about the destruction of the temple, and Jews around the world mourn the destruction of the second temple. In addition to losing the physical building of the temple, as you said, there was a seismic shift in the way Judaism was practiced, and that's pretty much the way our Judaism has been focused for the last 2,000 years. Is we no longer had a physical place to worship, and so Judaism shifted to more communal and synagogue-based worship. Today, many people, I think myself and you included, we're in the era of redemption. The diaspora Judaism needs to evolve and understand, in this era of redemption, we're changing, we're evolving and moving Judaism to its next phase. And that means this physical centrality of Jerusalem and the temple.
Right. If we want to look at it more philosophically, when God created the world, according to our belief, when God created the world, he started from the rock that's under the Dome of the Rock. That's according to Jewish mysticism. The Dome of the Rock is called the Dome of the Rock because under it there's a big piece of bedrock that sticks out of the ground. And on that bedrock sat the Ark of Covenant, the Aron HaBrit, right, which had inside the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments and a couple of other items. So if God started creating the world from that point and expanded outwards, the belief is that the most central part of his entire creation started there. That's also where we believe that again, we're talking Jewish mysticism. I'm trying to explain it in physical terms, but where the Holy Spirit of God himself rests is right there. And then from that point, it radiates outwards. So if that's the holiest point in the world, then the building around it is the holiest building, and then the courtyard. And then as you slowly get concentric circles moving outwards, you start having different levels of holiness in the world. As the whole, like the centrality of that was in the times of the temples, that like the temple was inside of the temple, the Holy of Holies was the holiest, then there was the temple, then there was Jerusalem, then there was Israel, and then there was the rest of the world. Once the temple was destroyed, the seismic shift in Jewish religious belief that you're talking about was that now we decided to create many, many small temples, so to speak. We created synagogues and communities all around the world, wherever the Jews were in the diaspora, and we created the place in which the Jewish spiritual existence can exist. It didn't have to be a beautiful, huge building. It could be any place where Jews gather to pray, to bring that spirituality into its physical existence. So we created that all over the diaspora, and that held us through all of our time in the diaspora, so we can now come back and we're home, and we now have Israel, and we have Jerusalem, and hopefully soon we'll have a temple where we can start re-centralizing all of our spirituality and bring it back together.
Okay. When you go onto the Temple Mount today, there's actually a sign outside that says, and I'm going to quote, according to Torah law, entering the Temple Mount area is strictly prohibited due to the holiness of the site. And this is a plaque put up by the chief rabbinate of Israel. So the chief rabbinate of Israel puts this warning at the entrance to the Temple Mount. All right. Specifically, Rabbi Shmuel Rabinovitz, the rabbi of the Kotel and the Western Wall, is very adamant that the holiness of the temple is now in the area of the Western Wall, and under Jewish law, Jews are forbidden to go up to the temple.
Well, that rabbi is wrong, and I think he has a vested interest in the Kotel staying the holiest place for him, because if it's not, then he's out of a job. But the approach that the chief rabbinate is taking in that sign is what I was talking at the beginning. I'm not willing to accept the fact that we now know where you're allowed to and not allowed to go. Because again, if you don't purify yourself properly, or you go in an area and you walk in an area that you're not allowed to go in, that is a astronomical transgression of Jewish law. Even if it's done accidentally or unintentionally, it is a very, very large transgression that is very clear. It's very clear in all of the religious texts that the punishment is what's called karet, where you get cut off from the nation. On a spiritual level, you're not thrown out of the nation, but it's a very extreme punishment that's listed because it's a huge transgression to go onto the Temple Mount in an impure state, and especially to go in an impure state into areas that you shouldn't be going at all, even if you were pure. So they're taking the approach of it's better to be extraordinarily safe than sorry. So because we're not 1,000,000% sure, we're only 100% sure, so we're going to say you're not allowed up at all. And again, it goes back by accepting that you're allowed, then you have to, and then it shifts the entire structure of religious belief again, which also would make the chief rabbinate, kind
of irrelevant.
It would make them completely irrelevant, because the centrality of Jewish practice would shift back to the Kohanim and the Leviim, the priestly class that exists, that would then become the leaders of the spiritual religious life and not the rabbinate.
Okay, I think we're touching on politics, which I think it's a great point. We're going to have to segue now into the legal aspect of the Temple Mount. The going up to the Temple Mount has become far more popular over the last couple of years. Legally and practically, why do you think that's been the case? And give us a little bit of the background into what has practically and legally taken place to allow this shift to happen.
So I think that legally going up to Har HaBayit, first of all, you have to understand, for Jews to go up to Har HaBayit, you're limited Sunday through Thursday from 7 in the morning till 10 o'clock in the morning, and then again from 11 to 1. I might be slightly off in the hours in the afternoon, but you have 4 hours a day that Jews are allowed to go up. It's only through one gate. It's only after passing through metal detectors and being searched by the police that you have no visible religious paraphernalia on you. Your entire time up there, you're accompanied usually by about 5 to 10 police officers who are filming every single movement you make and maintaining the peace for them. Anytime there's a Muslim holiday and every Friday, Jews are not allowed up at all. The place becomes Judenrein, Jew-free. So that's the practical side of it. The legal side of it. There's been a constant fight back and forth of Jews praying on the Temple Mount. That's the big legal question.
Okay, I have to stop. So initially we spoke about Moshe Dayan making this verbal agreement called the status quo with the Waqf. Now, it was just a verbal agreement which became this idea, and everyone speaks about the status quo, maintaining the status quo, meaning don't shift the boundaries too much. But one of the issues is we do live in a democratic state. Everybody is entitled to their opinions and belief. Part of that would mean that Jews should be allowed to exercise their democratic right to pray or at least go up onto the Temple Mount. So then we said the Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of Jews going up to and even praying on the Temple Mount because it's a form of freedom of worship. So we'd initially spoken about the status quo, this verbal agreement in 1967 between Moshe Dayan and the Waqf that maintained the status quo of Jews not going up to pray on the Temple Mount. Now, even though this was a verbal agreement, it actually went to the Supreme Court. In our democracy, the Supreme Court ruled that in a country where there is freedom of association and freedom of worship, Jews should be allowed to pray on the Temple Mount. And there was a specific ruling about this in 2006.
Right. So I think the status quo, I want to shift for a minute on that here before I get to the Supreme Court ruling, which basically set very clearly the problem that's been existing till now. The status quo, if we go back to the status quo of 1967, then there's two mosques, one of which is inactive. So there's only one active mosque on Har HaBayit, not two. And Jews could go up any time of day they want, whenever they want, however they want, dressed however they like. Arabs, Muslims can go up.
2 gates.
Right. They had 2 gates to go up to. They can go freely. They don't have to be accompanied by the police. They're allowed to pray. They're allowed to not pray. They're allowed to do whatever they want. The same way Muslims are allowed to go up to anyone. Christians are allowed to go up as well. Over the years, that status quo has changed many, 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 many times. That's 1967. We're now in 2024. So over the course of those years, the status quo has never stayed that way. There's now 4 mosques on Har HaBayit, not 2. Jews are only allowed to go up a total of 4 hours a day, 6 days a week, and they're not allowed at all on Muslim holidays whatsoever to go up. They have to be accompanied by a police escort. They are not allowed to have any religious paraphernalia. You're not even allowed to take a prayer book up with you. Up until recently, if you would pray in any voice louder than a whisper, you would either be removed and detained, or removed and arrested, and removed and then told you're not allowed to come back for 6 months to a year without even going in front of a judge.
And there was a massive remodeling done.
Well, I was going to get to that. That was if we started in 1967 with 2 mosques. There were 2 added, one of which is a huge problem. One was in the Golden Gate, which is on the east side of the Temple Mount. They opened it up. They created a mosque inside. The police closed it. And then the Supreme Court let them open it back up. That was in 2019. But if we go back to 1996, under the Al-Aqsa Mosque, there is an area called the Solomon Stables, which over the course of a night, or maybe it was an entire weekend, they removed over 600 dump trucks of material, which is all archaeological important material from the basement area of the mosque, which is like the heart of the Temple Mount, and they just dumped it like in a garbage dump. 600 of them. Now, I personally know people that if you picked up a rock as a Jew, they would use the laws of removing archaeological artifacts from a significant site to prevent you from ever coming back. That became the largest mosque in the Middle East at that point. So now there's 4 active mosques on the Temple Mount. There's multiple Muslim religious schools that have been opened on the northern side of the mount. There's a children's preschool that's opened on the northwestern side where they now play soccer outside frequently. And at the same time, Jews were slowly limited more and more and more and more in how they had access. So the status quo shifted since 1967. And now we're seeing a shift where thankfully we're starting to shift it ever so slightly back a little bit. Since over the last couple of years, since Corona actually, Jews have we've been able to pray in a little bit slightly higher tone than a whisper. We've been able, we still can't bring up religious paraphernalia, but at the same time, there have been more and more Jews being arrested and detained and then distanced from the mountain. And now, since Tisha B'Av, since the 9th of Av, when we commemorated the destruction of both temples, and hopefully this will continue shifting the status quo back towards a more equitable use of the space and allow the Jews the freedoms that they have. The Supreme Court ruling from 2006 it self-contradicts itself, which is not abnormal for Israeli Supreme Court rulings. I'll paraphrase and in English a little bit, where it basically ruled that under the laws of freedom of worship and freedom of religion, Jews have a right to pray freely on the Temple Mount, but at the same time, no right is unlimited and total. So the police can still prevent and curtail those freedoms in order to maintain public order. So all the Muslims have to do is threaten violence, and then the police have an excuse, which they use very, very frequently, to curtail the Jewish visitation rights to the Mount and their freedom of worship.
Okay. That's where we're at today. Clearly, you're very pro going up to and praying on the Temple Mount. Tell us about your experience.
So the first time I went up to the Temple Mount ever in my entire life, I actually went up as a Muslim. It was after I finished my military service. I had a friend who also had finished his military service at the time. He spoke fluent Arabic. He was American. I was American. We were kind of bored, and we would wander around the Arab shuk in the old city, saying that, we're 2 American brothers. We never met our father, but we just met him, and he was Muslim, and we're trying to get back in touch with our Muslim roots. And it was more just like us trying to get to know the other side, but in a way that like they would actually be honest with who they are. And one day, one of the gentlemen we were drinking coffee with said, "Hey, why don't you come and pray with us in our mosque?" And me, not really knowing anything of anything, went up to the Temple Mount with him. We did not go into the Dome of the Rock. We went into the Al-Aqsa Mosque to pray as Muslims, and he taught us the Muslim prayers. And it was a very interesting experience. Then many, 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 many years later, I have a friend who's involved with this organization I mentioned earlier, Biyadenu. He's now the director of the organization, Tom Nisani, who was having a very interesting conversation. He said, "Ari, how do you not go up as a religious Jew?" And it was not something that ever had occurred to me. And it happens that the first time I went up then was the day before the eve of Rosh Hashanah, of the Jewish New Year. And it was the first time I went up. I went up with the first group of Jews go up at 7:00 in the morning. And there's a rabbi, the head of the yeshiva that does all of the studying that I spoke about earlier, about all the laws involved in Harvard. He goes up every morning at 7 in the morning. He prays quietly under his breath. And it was an unbelievable spiritual experience. I felt it in my physical being, like in my bones and my skin. Like I felt the spirituality in a way that I had never felt it ever before in my life. And the next day in synagogue, when it was Rosh Hashanah, a day of deep prayer, the prayer service was like, it felt like it was 2 seconds. Like it really affected something inside of me. That was, I'd say, about 6-7 years ago. And then since then I try and, I take it, it's a process, because I have to go to a ritual immersion beforehand in the water, and then you have to find parking and walk there, and you get there. I go early so that it's not too hot, and I try and go up now every the day before Rosh Hashanah every year, and at least then and on Tisha B'Av. I went up this year on Tisha B'Av, and it was extraordinary. And I try and go again 1 or 2 other times during the year as well. It was actually right before the war started, right before the current war we're in started. So for Erev Rosh Hashanah, the day before Rosh Hashanah, is also my son's bar mitzvah. So he had come up with me a few other times in the past, but this time he came up with me in the morning, and I had the ability, there's a special blessing you say on your son when he turns bar mitzvah, and I was able to give him that blessing on the Temple Mount, and it was an extraordinary experience, and it was amazing to him too, and he was glad he came up with me, and it's an extraordinary spiritual experience if it's for you.
Okay, so now I've got to put in my perspective on this. I very much understand, and as a believing Jew, I understand the religious aspect, if you want to even call it the religious obligation to go up and pray on the Temple Mount. However, it is a political act. So, for me, what should be a purely religious act is tainted by politics. Alternatively, if you're going up for a political act to say we're here and you're demonstrating that politically Israel is now sovereign, the Jews have returned, this is the future of Judaism, you're using a spiritual place to make a political statement. And that is where at the moment I am stuck with regards to the Temple Mount, where I have those two things. Now, I don't expect anybody to give me an answer. I think it's a very personal thing for me. But that is where I am, and that's probably the reason why at the moment I haven't yet been able to get myself to the Temple Mount.
So I think, Sean, you hit a very sensitive note for many, many, many religious Jews. It's exactly that point. Something that's supposed to be purely spiritual is tainted by politics. And at the same time, the politics are so extraordinarily important, and it shouldn't have to be mixed with religion. So first of all, I will be going up to the Temple Mount in a few short weeks on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, and you're welcome to join me and experience it. When I go up as a purely spiritual going up. I'm not interested in the politics of it. For me, it's an experience for me to commune and recharge my spiritual batteries. And I don't think there is an answer to that dilemma, because the reality is that it's become a political issue. I don't think we made it a political issue. I think that as you explained in your historical recap from the very beginning, that as soon as our enemies conquered and destroyed our temple, they built a temple of theirs in its place. They tried to co-opt almost our religious and spiritual existence as their own, and say, oh no, look, we conquered you and we destroyed you, it's now ours. And they turned what's supposed to be the centrality of spirituality in the world into a political statement. And yes, there are people that go up for politics to show that we're here and we haven't given up and we're in charge, and one day we will rebuild our temple, hopefully. And then there are people like me that go up where I happen to agree with all those politics, but when I go up, it's purely spiritual for me.
Okay, I appreciate that. Unfortunately, we're going to have to end this discussion here, because I'm sure we can keep going on for hours. As always, we try and end on a happy note. So this is going to be mine. 3 times a day, we say the Amidah prayer. And one of the brachot, one of the blessings we say, ends in the following way. Baruch atah Hashem, amachzir shchinato leTzion. And specifically, what does that mean? Is that we ask God to return his presence to Jerusalem, meaning the temple area. And I always find it fascinating for any Jew across the political divide who prays and believes in God, even if you are anti-Zionist or agnostic towards Zionism, you're saying a prayer that specifically asks God to rebuild the temple and return his presence to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem.
Exactly. because that's our goal. And I think that I'm going to go from there, and I'm going to give my positive note is that building off of that, now after the thousands of years of Jewish history, and even now that we don't have our physical temple at all, we still commemorate to this day the destruction of that temple. There's no other nation in the world that commemorates an event that happened over 1,000 years ago in their history and feels the pain like we do. And knowing that we are an eternal people, and our belief is so strong that no matter what, we will always be victorious over our enemies, whether they're physical enemies like we have at the moment as Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran, or if they're spiritual enemies trying to destroy the values and the morality of the world. We will always be victorious in the end, and we will come back. And as we've done in the past, when we rebuilt our temple the second time, we will return more fully than we already have, and we will rebuild the third temple. And that's what leaves me optimistic towards our future.
Thanks very much. And that's the end of our episode. As always, our goal is to bring more insight and our own personal views into some of the issues in Israel. Please like, share, subscribe, and if you have any comments, please let us know what you felt about this episode and tell your friends.
And once again, I want to say thank you and remind anyone that if they are looking for more information or details of people to lead a group up and give even a class, not necessarily on the amount about it, you can reach out to Biadenu. A link to their website will be in the show notes, and you can reach out to us as well.
We hope to be back next week with another episode.